He buried his heart with a woman who never came back. And for 2 years, nobody in Pine Hollow even noticed he was already gone. Nobody except her. This is the story of a man who forgot how to want things, a woman who saw him clearly when he couldn't see himself, and one brutal winter that stripped away every excuse either of them had left to stay alone. If you've ever lost someone and wondered whether you were allowed to want more, this story is for you. Watch until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The first hard frost of the season came on a Thursday. Gavin Mercer knew it before he opened his eyes. He could feel it in the way the air sat differently against the cabin walls. Thicker, somehow, quieter. The way cold has of pressing the whole world flat and still. He lay in the dark for a moment, staring up at the ceiling he'd patched 3 times now and still hadn't gotten right. And he did what he did every morning. He counted the reasons to get up. The horses, the sheep, the water trough that would have a skin of ice across the top if he didn't get out there soon. The fire that needed feeding, the oats he'd promised himself he'd move to the dry side of the barn before they went soft. 6 things. That was usually enough. He did not count her anymore. He had made himself stop doing that sometime around the 8-month mark. Stop reaching across the bed in the half-dark. Stop turning to say something before he remembered. Stopping had been its own kind of violence, but he'd done it. You could get used to almost anything if you were stubborn enough and had enough chores. He pulled on his boots and went outside. Pine Hollow sat in a narrow valley carved between 2 granite ridges, the kind of place that felt hidden on purpose, like the mountain had closed its hand around it and forgotten to let go. There were 43 families here, give or take, depending on how you counted the McAllister cousins who'd been threatening to leave for Wyoming since the spring of '85 and showed no real signs of doing it. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a one-room schoolhouse, a church made of pine lumber that had darkened to the color of old tea, and a single street of storefronts that dead-ended at the base of the eastern ridge. It was the kind of place where everybody knew your business, and most of them had opinions about it. Gavin owned the stable at the south end of town, plus a spread of grazing land beyond the tree line where he ran 60-something sheep and a rotating cast of horses he boarded for other ranchers. He'd bought the property with Margaret, with the idea of Margaret, really, with the version of the future they'd been building together. And for the first year after she died, he'd been dimly aware that he should probably sell it. Move somewhere that didn't have her fingerprints on every wall. He hadn't sold it. He wasn't sure if that was grief or stubbornness, or just the fact that selling required making a decision, and he'd run out of energy for those. 2 years on, the stable was his. It was the only thing that was really cleanly his. He understood horses and sheep in a way he didn't understand people anymore. Animals didn't expect conversation. They didn't give you a look over the supper table that meant, "Are you all right?" when what they really meant was, "You're making the rest of us uncomfortable." He could breathe around animals. He couldn't always breathe around people. Sunday came the way it always did, too fast and too slow at the same time. Gavin put on his good shirt, the one with the collar that sat a little stiff, and he drove his wagon into town by 8:15, same as always. He tied the horse at the post on the east side of the church, same as always. He walked in through the side door, not the front. The front required standing on the steps and shaking hands and answering the question, "How are you getting on, Gavin?" with something other than the truth. He slid into the third pew from the back, left side, end of the row. Same seat, every week, 2 years running. He wasn't hiding, exactly. Or maybe he was, a little. But it was more that he'd found a position in the room that required the least from him. He could hear the service, participate in the standing and sitting and the occasional hymn, and be out the door and back on the road before anyone could get a good run at him. It was a system. Systems were the only thing keeping him functional some weeks. The organ started up just as he was settling in. He didn't look at the organist. He'd learned not to. Looking led to noticing, and noticing led to the low, uncomfortable pull in his chest that he didn't have a name for and didn't particularly want one. But the thing about Evelyn Ashcroft was that she was hard not to notice, not because she was loud or dramatic or trying to be seen. It was almost the opposite. She played the organ the way she seemed to do everything, which was with complete, quiet attention. Like whatever was in front of her was the only thing in the world worth thinking about. She didn't perform. She just played. And there was something about that, about watching a person give themselves over entirely to something without any self-consciousness about it, that made it difficult to look away. Gavin looked away. He studied the wooden knot in the back of the pew in front of him and concentrated on breathing at a normal rate. Evelyn had noticed Gavin Mercer 6 weeks into her first autumn in Pine Hollow. She hadn't meant to. She had enough to occupy her attention. She was 26 years old, newly arrived from Cheyenne, still earning the trust of a schoolroom full of children whose parents had varying opinions about whether a woman ought to be doing this job at all. She was also learning the organ, filling in for old Clarence Pitts, who'd developed a tremor bad enough that he couldn't manage the keys anymore. She had plenty to think about, but there was something about the man in the third pew from the back that kept catching the edge of her attention. He was tall. She could tell even seated, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than intention. Dark hair going a little rough at the edges, like he'd gotten a haircut sometime in the past month and a half and hadn't thought about it since. Hands that he held loose in his lap, not folded, not fidgeting, just still. Like a man who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. He never talked to anyone. He always sat in the same spot. He was always gone 5 minutes after the service ended, faster than anyone with a wagon had a right to move. She'd asked Martha Hollis about him one afternoon when the children had gone home. Gavin Mercer. Martha had set down her cup with the particular care of a woman who had a story and was deciding whether to tell it. He owns the stable south of town, lost his wife. Oh, it'll be 2 years this January. Margaret, sweet woman. Fever took her fast, which I suppose is a mercy, but She'd stopped. He just sort of stopped after. You know how some people do, like the clock stops with them. Evelyn had thought about that for a long time. She knew something about stopped clocks. She knew something about the particular loneliness of still being alive when a version of yourself had quietly died. She did not approach Gavin Mercer. She was not the kind of woman to insert herself where she wasn't wanted, and she could read clearly enough, in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the speed at which he made for the door, that he had not come to church looking for conversation. But she watched him. Week after week, from the corner of her eye at the organ, she watched him in the same quiet way she tracked her students for signs of trouble. Not intrusively, not hopefully, just paying attention, because someone ought to. October folded into November, the way it did in the mountains, without ceremony and without mercy. The temperature dropped in hard steps, each week colder than the last. Gavin moved his morning routine earlier to account for frozen water troughs. He started keeping his boots by the stove. He ate more because the cold burned more. And he didn't sleep as well, because the wind off the eastern ridge hit the cabin at an angle that made the whole structure sound like it was holding a conversation with itself. He still came to church every Sunday. He wouldn't have been able to explain why exactly if anyone had pressed him. It wasn't that he was particularly devout. He'd had some hard conversations with his faith in the year after Margaret died, and they had not resolved cleanly. It was more that it was the one fixed point in his week that required him to be somewhere specific at a specific time, washed and dressed, and present in a way that working alone on a spread couldn't require of him. Left to his own devices, Gavin suspected he might eventually stop marking time altogether. The church gave him Sunday. Sunday gave him a hinge. And maybe there was something else, something he was not prepared to examine directly, the way you didn't look straight at the sun. The second Sunday in November, he came in through the side door as usual, took his pew as usual, and settled in with his hands loose in his lap. The organ started. He studied the knot in the wood. What he noticed, what he couldn't help noticing because the church was quiet enough that sound traveled, was that she played a small mistake in the second verse of the opening hymn, caught it, adjusted, and kept going without breaking the rhythm. Like a person who knew that perfection wasn't the point and didn't waste time being embarrassed. He didn't know why that almost made him smile. He looked at the knot in the wood and did not smile. The last Sunday of November was the day Gavin Mercer spoke to Evelyn Ashcroft for the first time. It was an accident, which was probably the only way it could have happened. He'd been making for the door, coat already on, hat in hand, when he came around the end of the pew and nearly walked directly into her. She was coming from the organ bench with a stack of sheet music in both arms, and she stopped short and for a half-second they were standing close enough that he could see the particular gray-green of her eyes and the small ink stain on the second finger of her right hand. "Sorry," he said immediately, stepping back. "Wasn't watching." "Neither was I," she said. She had a calm, clear voice that matched her face, not blank exactly, but settled. "The music." She held up the stack as if explaining herself. "I stack it too high and then can't see over it." "Right." He was aware that he should say something else, something normal, something a person would say. "Good playing today." She looked at him for a moment, not evaluating, more like she was deciding whether he meant it. "I hit a wrong note in the second verse," she said. "I know." He hadn't meant to say that. "I mean, I noticed, but you caught it." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but adjacent to one. "Most people pretend they didn't hear it." "I'm not great at pretending." It came out more honest than he'd intended. He watched her take that in. "That's not a bad quality," she said finally. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it? The stable owner?" He was briefly surprised she knew his name, then remembered this was Pine Hollow, and of course she knew his name. "Gavin," he said, because Mr. Mercer sounded like his father. "Yeah. Evelyn Ashcroft." She shifted the stack of music. "I teach the school." "I know." He'd known that since August. He hadn't meant to admit that either. She looked at him again in that direct way, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being read, not unkindly, but clearly, like a page held up to the light. "Well," she said, "I should get these sorted before they fall on someone." She nodded toward the pile of sheet music. "Good morning, Gavin." "Morning," he said. And that was it. 45 seconds, maybe a minute. He was out the door before he'd fully processed that it had happened, and most of the way home before he noticed that for 45 seconds he had not been thinking about anything except the conversation. It was such a small thing. He couldn't explain why it sat in his chest the rest of the day, like something warm. December came in ugly. The old-timers in Pine Hollow could feel it before it arrived, in the pressure of the air, in the way the animals were unsettled and restless, in the particular color of the sky over the western ridge that Hector Aldous, who'd been working this valley for 30 years, called the bad kind of gray. "Going to be a winter," Hector told anyone who'd listen, at the general store, at the smithy, in the churchyard. Not a regular winter, the bad kind. Most people listened to Hector. He'd been wrong twice in 3 decades, and both times it had still been a hard winter, just not as hard as he'd predicted. You couldn't afford to dismiss that kind of track record. Gavin spent the first 2 weeks of December moving hay. It was not a glamorous task. It required a wagon and a strong back and a willingness to do the same motion approximately 400 times in a row. He moved hay from the upper pasture to the stable, from the secondary barn to the main barn, from the lean-to to anywhere with a solid roof, and he stacked it with the particular care of a man who had lost livestock to a bad winter once before and had no intention of doing it again. He reinforced the stable walls. He checked every seam in the sheep shelter. He brought the most vulnerable ewes, the 2 who'd been sick in autumn, the oldest one, into the barn proper, which they protested loudly and at length. "I know," he told them. "It's not ideal." They continued to protest. "It's going to get cold," he said. "Work with me." His neighbor, Roy Phipps, came by one afternoon while Gavin was on the roof of the main barn checking for gaps in the boards. "You really think it's going to be as bad as Hector says?" Roy called up. "Don't know." Gavin drove a nail. "But I'd rather do all this work and be wrong than not do it and be right." Roy squinted up at him. "You doing all right, Gavin?" There it was, that question, wrapped in weather talk, snuck in sideways, but there. "Doing fine, Roy." He drove another nail. Roy stood there another minute, like he might push it, then thought better of it. "Well, if you need an extra hand before the cold hits, I'm all right." He said it without heat. "Appreciate it." Roy left. Gavin kept nailing boards. He was doing fine. He was doing what needed doing. That was the same thing, near enough. The second Sunday in December, Gavin arrived at church to find a conversation happening in the doorway that he couldn't easily get around. The conversation involved Evelyn Ashcroft, her sheet music, and a man Gavin didn't recognize, which, in Pine Hollow, meant he'd arrived recently. He was maybe 40, well-dressed in the deliberate way of someone who wanted you to notice they were well-dressed, with the kind of smile that came out smooth and quick, like he practiced it. "Miss Ashcroft," the man was saying, "I've heard the organ playing from halfway down the road every Sunday for 3 weeks now. I had to know who was responsible." Evelyn was holding her sheet music against her chest, the way she did. She was polite, Gavin could see that, attentive, not dismissive, but she also looked like someone who was performing politeness rather than feeling it. "That's very kind," she said. "Are you new to Pine Hollow?" "Arrived last month. Silas Crow. I've taken the old Hendricks property on the North Ridge." He said it in the tone of someone who expected that to mean something. The Hendricks property was the largest piece of land on the north side of the valley, which explained the suit. "I understand you also run the school." "I do." "Remarkable." His smile expanded. A woman of many talents. Gavin felt something in him tighten. Not jealousy, he told himself immediately. He didn't have standing for jealousy. He had said 35 words to this woman total, but some other thing, some older protective instinct that he hadn't felt in a while and didn't know what to do with. He went around the long way, through the gap between the building and the hitching post, and came in through the side door. He sat in his pew. He put his hat on his knee. From his angle, through the narrow window on the left side, he could see the steps. He watched Silas Crow escort Evelyn Ashcroft through the front door with one hand just barely at her elbow. The most minimal possible touch, the most deliberate possible statement. Gavin looked at the knot in the wood. The organ started. She played clean all the way through, no missed notes. He didn't know why that made him feel worse. After the service, he stayed seated a moment longer than usual. He didn't know why. He just wasn't moving yet. "You're one of the few people who actually sit still during the closing prayer." He turned. Evelyn was at the end of his pew, sheet music in arms, same as that first time. She was watching him with an expression he was starting to recognize, curious but not pushy about it, like she was asking a question she'd be fine not getting the answer to. "I don't rush very well," he said. "Most people don't, they just pretend to." She set the music on the pew beside him and flexed her fingers, both hands, a practiced motion, like she did it every week. "The keys get stiff in the cold. My hands don't love November." He glanced at her hands without meaning to. The gloves she'd been wearing earlier were tucked in her coat pocket, and he could see, now that he was looking, that the cuffs of her coat were worn. Not badly, not noticeably to someone who wasn't paying attention, but the fabric at the edges was starting to go thin and pale, the way wool did when it had given everything it had. "Cold setting in your fingers?" he asked. "The last 10 minutes of playing, yes." She said it without complaint, just fact. "I wrap them before I come in, but it doesn't hold." He nodded. He filed it away without knowing quite why, in the same category as the ink stain, the way she caught her own mistakes, the way she'd looked at Silas Crow like she was waiting for the exit from the conversation. "I saw you talking to the new man," he said. He hadn't meant to say it. Something moved across her face. Not quite amusement, but not far from it. "Silas Crow." She picked up her sheet music. "He's very enthusiastic." "Seems like it." She looked at him directly then, and he had that page held up to light feeling again. "You don't like him," she said. It wasn't an accusation. "I don't know him." Gavin pulled his hat off his knee and turned it in his hands. He stopped. Never mind. She waited. She was good at waiting. She didn't fill silence the way some people did, with more words, with noise, with pressure. "He had his hand on your elbow before he knew your name," Gavin said finally. "That's all?" The almost smile came back. "I noticed that too," she said quietly. They looked at each other for a moment, just a moment, and something passed between them that Gavin couldn't name and wasn't ready to look at directly. "Well," she said, "I should get these sorted." "Yeah." He stood, put on his hat. "Good morning, Miss Ashcroft." "Evelyn," she said, same as he'd corrected her the first time. She was already moving toward the door. He watched her go. He stood in the empty church for another 30 seconds, hat in hand, feeling foolish and oddly, specifically awake, the way you felt after stepping into cold air when you'd been inside too long. Then he put on his coat and went home to count his reasons. The night before the third Sunday of December, it started to snow. Gavin woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of it. Not the snowfall itself, which was silent, but the change in sound it caused, the way the wind shifted and the familiar creaks of the cabin changed pitch. He lay still and listened and felt the weight of it before he got up to check. He stood at the door in his coat and held his lantern out into the dark. The snow was coming down in a wall. Not individual flakes, a wall. He could see the beam of his lantern travel about 8 feet before the white simply swallowed it. "Hell," he said quietly, to nobody. He got dressed and went to check the animals. The sheep were restless, huddled in the barn in a way that told him they'd known before he had. He counted heads, all 64, and checked the feed and put down extra straw and listened to the building groan around him. He went back inside and stoked the fire and sat down at the table and looked at his hands. The cold pressed against every wall. He thought about Sunday, about whether he should go in. He went. Boom. The road into Pine Hollow was nearly impassable. It took him almost an hour and a half to cover the distance that normally took 20 minutes, and by the time he tied the horse at the church post, his arms ached from managing the wagon through drifts that came up past the wheel hubs. He was late. The service had already started. He pushed through the side door and stopped. The church was full. Completely, unprecedentedly full. Every family in Pine Hollow, and several from outside it, people packed into pews and standing along the walls. Children tucked between parents. Old Hector Aldous near the front looking vindicated. Evelyn at the organ, playing with fierce, focused energy like the music was keeping the walls up. Reverend Hollis was at the pulpit, and he broke off mid-sentence when Gavin entered. "Mr. Mercer," he said with audible relief. "Good. Come in, come in." Gavin looked around. The windows were white, and not frost white, completely white, packed snow against the glass. "We've had a development," the Reverend said, in a tone that meant things were bad, but he was going to be calm about it. "Tom Reardon went out to check the road north 10 minutes ago. He came back to let us know that the pass is gone." The room was very quiet. "How gone?" somebody asked from the left side. "Drifted over. 6, 7 feet in the low spots." The Reverend folded his hands. "Until the snow stops and we can dig out, we're not going anywhere, which means Pine Hollow is spending Sunday together." Gavin stood at the back of the room with snow melting off his coat and understood, in a sudden and absolute way, that he was not going to be able to disappear today. He looked, without meaning to, across the room to the organ bench. Evelyn Ashcroft was already looking back at him. She held his gaze for half a second. Not long, but long enough, and her expression said clearly that she understood exactly what he was thinking. Then she looked back at her sheet music and kept playing. The snow came down outside. The church held its warmth. Gavin found a stretch of wall near the back, leaned against it with his arms folded, and tried to remember how to be in a room full of people for longer than 45 minutes. He had a feeling he was about to get a lot of practice. By noon, the women of Pine Hollow had performed what Gavin privately considered a small logistical miracle. 3 cast-iron stoves in the church were going full bore. Someone had produced a considerable quantity of dried beans from somewhere. Martha Hollis had, inexplicably, brought enough flour and lard for biscuits. "I always pack extra," she said, in a tone that suggested she was not surprised by this turn of events, and possibly had been waiting for it. Ruth Aldous had a pot of something that smelled like it had been going since Thursday. Children had been organized into table clearing and wood fetching operations with remarkable efficiency. By 12:30, the pews had been rearranged into something like a dining hall. By 1 o'clock, everyone was eating. Gavin sat near the east wall where he'd found a gap between the Phipps family and old Ward Jennings, who was 80-something and mostly deaf, and therefore unlikely to start a conversation. He ate his beans and his biscuit and kept his eyes on the middle distance and tried to be present without being available. "There's a seat here if you want it." He looked up. Evelyn was standing at the end of the table with a bowl in each hand, for herself and apparently for him, since one bowl was empty, and she set it down in front of him and took the space across the table before he'd managed to process the exchange. "Oh," he said. Yeah, thank you." "You were eating standing up," she said, as if this explained it. "I couldn't watch that." "I don't mind standing. I mind watching." She settled across from him and started eating with the same focused attention she brought to everything. No ceremony. He picked up his spoon. They ate in silence for a moment, which was, he was surprised to find, not uncomfortable. It was just silence. The room around them was full of noise and movement, and children's voices and someone near the stove arguing about the proper way to make salt pork, and somehow that created enough sound that sitting quietly in the middle of it didn't feel like a failure to communicate. "Do you do this often?" she asked eventually. He glanced up. "Eat beans? Come to church," she said with the ghost of a smile. "You're always there, but you're never there." He turned his spoon in his hand. "I come every week." "You do," she agreed. She wasn't pushing it. She was just observing. "My first month here, I thought you were leaving early for some reason. Took me a while to realize you were always on time. You just moved very fast. I have things to get back to." "On Sundays?" He looked at her. "Animals don't know it's Sunday." She considered this. "That's true." She took a bite. "What do you run? Horses, mostly?" "I've seen the stable." "Horses and sheep. 64 head of sheep right now, 20 horses I board for other ranchers. Few of my own." He paused. 67 horses if you count the 3 the Caldwells left when they moved to Wyoming, but that's a legal question I haven't resolved. She almost laughed at that. Not quite, but something in her face went bright for a second. "That does sound like a legal question." "They left me a note." He shook his head. The note said, and I'm quoting, "Gavin, sorry about the horses." She did laugh then, a short, real laugh. Not performed, not polite, just genuine. It was a good sound. He hadn't made anyone laugh in a while. He realized, sitting across from her in the crowded church with snow piling up against the white windows, that he had not felt this specific thing, this small, particular ease, in a very long time. He didn't know what to do with that. So he ate his beans. "Do you enjoy it?" she asked. "The work?" "Yeah." He said it without thinking, then considered. "Yeah, I like the animals more than most of what comes with them, but even the hard parts." He stopped. "My father had a saying, something like, 'Work that needs doing is the best company there is.'" "Because it doesn't judge you," she said. He looked up. She said it simply, like it was obvious, and maybe it was, but he hadn't expected her to see the thing underneath the thing. "Something like that," he said. She nodded and went back to her food. She didn't make anything of it. She just perceived it and moved on. He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the snow kept falling. Ward Jennings fell asleep upright on Gavin's left. The smell of biscuits and wood smoke layered over the cold that came through the cracks. A child somewhere in the back of the room started crying, then stopped. "The organ," he said, and then didn't know where he was going. She raised an eyebrow. "You play like you don't care if anyone hears it," he said, "like it's just for itself." She was quiet for a moment. "My teacher told me once that an audience can always tell when you're playing for them versus when you're playing because you can't not. The second one sounds better." She looked at her bowl. "I don't know if she was right, but I believed her." "She was right," Gavin said. Evelyn looked at him, and he had the light-through-paper feeling again, and this time he didn't look away quite as fast. The snow didn't stop. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that nobody was going home tonight, which produced a complicated reorganization of the church's interior that involved arguing and compromise, and at one point, Hector Aldis threatening to sleep under one of the pews, which turned out to not be a threat, but just something he wanted to try. Children were arranged on blankets near the warmest stove. The elderly got the remaining pews. Everyone else found spots on the floor, against walls, under the tables that had been their dining room at noon. Gavin helped move benches. It was something to do with his hands, and he was better at hauling things than navigating the social logistics. So he moved what needed moving and didn't get in the way of Martha Hollis, who was running the operation with the calm efficiency of a general who'd been waiting for this particular war. At one point, he came back from bringing in wood to find that his spot near the east wall had been claimed by the Wheeler family's 3 youngest, who were asleep in a pile like puppies. He stood and looked at them for a moment. "You can take the spot by the organ," said a voice beside him. He turned. Evelyn was there with a folded blanket over her arm. "It's warmer over there," she said. "The stovepipe runs behind the wall." "I don't want to take your spot. I've got the bench." She nodded toward the organ bench, which was narrow and would be deeply uncomfortable. But he understood why she'd chosen it. She was not the kind of person who went looking for comfort at someone else's inconvenience. "I've slept in worse places." "Where?" He said it before he thought about it. She looked at him, surprised. Then, "Coming out here from Cheyenne, February, 2 years ago. The stage broke a wheel at night 10 miles from the nearest settlement." She paused. "We slept under it. At least it was out of the wind." "That's worse than a church bench," he admitted. "Substantially." She moved toward the organ, set her blanket on the bench. "Get some sleep, Gavin." He stood near the wall he'd claimed by the stovepipe's warmth and watched her settle in on the narrow bench, back straight, blanket around her shoulders. Sheet music stacked neatly on the floor beside her. She looked at the keys for a moment. Then she looked up and caught him watching, and he expected to feel embarrassed, but instead she just nodded once, the small, calm nod of someone who had taken a quiet inventory and found everything in order. He lay down on the floor. He stared at the ceiling. Sleep, when it came, was easier than it had been in a long time. Morning came gray and still. The snow had stopped some time before dawn. The silence woke him before anything else. The particular silence of a world buried under too much white, where sound just didn't carry the same. He was up and outside before most people, checking the sky, calculating. The drifts against the church walls were shoulder high. The road, if you could call it a road, was indistinguishable from the field beside it. They were not going home yet. He went back inside, stoked the stoves, started water for coffee, using the last of the grounds someone had produced from a bag in their wagon. He moved quietly, the way he moved at home in the early morning, without thinking about it. "You do this every morning?" Evelyn was sitting up on the organ bench, blanket still around her shoulders, hair no longer as carefully arranged as it had been yesterday. She looked like someone who had slept badly on a narrow bench and was making no particular effort to hide it. He found that he liked this. He didn't examine why. "Do what?" he said. "Move around quietly like everyone else is made of glass." He thought about it. "Animals," he said. "You learn not to startle them. You're treating us like sheep." The comparison was unflattering to the sheep, he said, and he didn't quite smile, but it was close and she saw it, and her eyes went warm in a way that made him look back at the coffee. "Is there enough for 2?" she asked. "Barely. I'll take barely." She unfolded herself from the bench and came to stand beside him at the stove, close enough that he was aware of the specific few inches between them. She wrapped her hands around the cup he handed her, and he watched her fingers flex around the warmth. The sleeves of her coat were still thin at the cuffs. He could see the worn fabric in the gray morning light. He filed it away. They stood by the stove while the church slept around them, and they didn't say anything, and it was the most natural thing that had happened to Gavin Mercer in 2 years. He didn't know what that meant. He thought maybe he was starting to. The second day inside the church was harder than the first. Not because of the cold, though the cold was real and persistent, finding its way through every gap in the pine boards with the particular patience of something that had all winter to work with. Not because of the food, which was running lean. Martha Hollis had taken inventory that morning with a face that gave nothing away, which was itself a kind of answer. It was harder because of what happened when people who were used to their own space and their own silence were pressed together long enough for the pretending to wear off. By mid-morning of the second day, the Reardon boys had gotten into a fight over a blanket. Old Hector Aldous was repeating the same story about the winter of '71 for the third time to anyone who hadn't moved fast enough. Ruth Aldous had cried once, quietly, near the back window, when she thought no one could see, because she was worried about her chickens. And she knew worrying about chickens was small, but she couldn't help it. 2 of the younger children had developed coughs that bounced off the wooden walls in a way that made everyone quietly uncomfortable. Gavin helped where he could, which mostly meant physical things. He and Roy Phipps went out twice to bring in wood, fighting through drifts that had reformed overnight, and came back both times looking like men who had been in a losing argument with the weather. He fixed the hinge on the side door that had been complaining since yesterday. He helped Roy's oldest boy, maybe 14 and trying very hard to seem useful, figure out the correct way to bank a stove so it held heat through the night. He did not go looking for Evelyn, but he was aware, in the low, constant way you were aware of weather, of where she was in the room. She had taken over a corner near the south wall and was doing something he hadn't expected. Teaching. Not the formal kind. She had no slate, no chalk, nothing, but she'd gathered 4 or 5 of the older children around her and was telling them something, quietly, and they were listening in the way children only listened when they actually wanted to, which was its own accomplishment. He watched for a moment while pretending to examine the wood stacking he'd already finished. One of the children said something. She laughed and bent her head closer, and the child's face opened up like a window. He went back to the stove. Roy Phipps came up beside him and handed him a cup of something that was mostly hot water with a vague memory of coffee in it. "She's good with them," Roy said, following his gaze. "Yeah," Gavin said. "My Clara says she's the best teacher the school's had in 10 years. Roy wrapped both hands around his cup. "Stays late, comes in early. Actually seems to—" He paused. "You know, care." Gavin knew. That was the thing about Evelyn Ashcroft that he'd been unable to put a name to for weeks. She was not performing caring the way some people did, with the right words and the right expressions and the invisible expectation of credit. She just actually cared. It came off her naturally, without effort, without announcement. That was rarer than it sounded. He'd known plenty of people who were good at seeming kind. He could count on one hand the ones who actually were. "She staying here long, you think?" Roy asked. Gavin looked at him. Roy shrugged. "I mean, Cheyenne's a bigger city. More opportunity. Some of these young women, they come out here, stay a couple years, then—" He made a vague gesture. "Move on." Gavin had not thought about this before. He thought about it now, briefly and uncomfortably, the way you pressed a bruise before you knew it was there. "Don't know," he said, and drank his coffee-flavored water. Silas Crow had been making himself useful in the most visible possible ways since morning. Gavin had observed this with the objectivity he was trying to maintain and the limited success he was having at it. Silas had produced, from his wagon, which he'd apparently stocked like a man who expected to spend the winter providing for small communities, 2 pounds of sugar, a smoked ham, and a bottle of something amber that he offered to the men with the expansive generosity of someone who understood that generosity in public was its own kind of currency. He was not a bad man, Gavin thought carefully. He was just a man who knew exactly what he was doing and did it with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. At noon, Silas sat beside Evelyn at the makeshift meal and talked for most of it. Gavin ate his food at the far end of the same table and looked at the wall and listened to things he wasn't trying to hear. "The property's got good bones," Silas was saying. "The previous owner didn't have the capital to develop it properly, but with the right investment—" He paused to let that weight settle. "A man can build something significant out here, if he's willing to commit." "What kind of significant?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was polite. "Cattle, primarily. There's a rail connection coming through the northern pass in the next few years. I've got it on good authority. Which changes everything about this valley's potential." He leaned slightly forward. "The men who are positioned correctly when that happens will do very well." Evelyn said, which was not yes, but was not no either. "You've been here how long?" Silas asked. "Coming up on 15 months, so 15 months. And you're content? Here, I mean, with a schoolteacher's—" He seemed to select his next word carefully. "Scope?" There was a pause. Gavin found himself very still. "Scope is an interesting word for it," Evelyn said. Her voice had gone slightly cooler, not rude, but precise. "I think what you're asking is whether I'm satisfied with a smaller life. I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant," she said it without edges. "I'm exactly where I chose to be, Mr. Crow. That tends to produce its own kind of contentment." Silas recovered smoothly. He was good at recovering, and turned the conversation somewhere easier, and Evelyn went with it, because she was polite, and it was a small room, and they were going to be here for at least another day. Gavin ate his food. He had said nothing. He had no right to say anything. He was a man at the far end of a table, eating a meal, minding his business. He was also, he realized, gripping his spoon hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. He put the spoon down and breathed. The afternoon got long. This was the particular tyranny of being confined. Time moved differently when you couldn't do what you normally did with it. Gavin was a man who measured his days in tasks completed, distances covered, problems solved with his hands. Sitting still inside a room while a blizzard made decisions for him went against something fundamental in his architecture. He ended up near the south window, the one that faced open country, and he stood and watched the white nothing outside and thought about his sheep. The barn was solid. He'd made sure of that. That was what the 2 weeks of preparation had been for, and he'd left extra feed and the ewes were inside. They were fine. He knew they were fine. He still stood and thought about them because it was better than thinking about other things. "You're doing the calculation again," said a voice. He turned. Evelyn was beside him, close enough that he was aware again of that particular careful few inches between them. "What calculation?" he said. "The one where you go through everything you did before you left and try to figure out if it's enough." She was looking out the window. "I do it too, with the schoolroom. Did I bank the small stove? Did I latch the shutter on the east window? Did I—" She paused. "It doesn't help, but we do it anyway." "My sheep are probably fine," he said. "Your sheep are definitely fine. You're the most prepared man in this valley." She said it simply, not flattery, just observation. "Roy Phipps told my neighbor that you spent 2 weeks moving hay before the snow hit. He said you were either crazy or you knew something nobody else did." "I just listened to Hector." Nobody else listened to Hector. "People don't listen to old men enough," Gavin said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed a curtain of snow sideways across the field, slow and enormous. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He glanced at her. "You're going to anyway." "Probably," she admitted, and that almost smile. "You've been coming to that same pew for as long as I've been here. And you always leave before anyone can get to you." She kept her eyes on the window. "You don't have to tell me why. I'm just—" She paused, choosing. "I've been curious." The honest answer sat in him like a stone at the bottom of water, clear but heavy. "My wife died," he said. "January 2 years ago." She didn't say "I'm sorry" immediately, the way most people did, filling the space before it had a chance to breathe. She just received it, let it exist for a moment. "Margaret," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Martha Hollis." "Martha Hollis," she confirmed. "She didn't tell me much, just that it happened and that you'd been different after." "I wasn't different, I was less." He said it matter-of-factly, because that was what it had been. Like, he thought about how to say it. "You know how a fire that's been burning all day looks after the wood runs out? It's not out, but it's not what it was," she said. "Yeah." She turned to look at him then. Not the reading the page look, but something else, something more direct and more careful and more human. What was she like? Nobody asked him that. In 2 years, people had said, "I'm sorry," and "if you need anything," and "time heals." The standard phrases that were kindly meant and mostly useless. Nobody asked what she was like. He wasn't prepared for it. He felt the unpreparedness in his throat. "Loud," he said after a moment. It came out like something he hadn't meant to let go of. In a good way. She took up space. She had opinions about everything, and I mean everything. The right way to shoe a horse, the proper spice for a stew, which ridge the fence should run along. He stopped. I disagreed with her about half of it. She was still usually right. He shook his head. She had the kind of laugh that... He stopped again. "Sorry," he said. "Don't," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Don't apologize for it," she said. "She sounds like she was worth talking about." He stood with that for a long moment. The wind outside pressed against the glass. "Yeah," he said finally. She was. Evelyn looked back out the window. She didn't offer anything. No comparison, no story about her own losses, no attempt to balance the exchange. She just stood with him in it, the way someone stood with you in a cold room, not because they could make it warm, but because standing alone in the cold was worse. He had not stood next to someone in the cold who made it feel like less cold in 2 years. He didn't know what to do with that, so he did nothing. He watched the snow. After a while, she said, "I should help Martha with the evening meal." "Yeah." He didn't move. She turned to go, then paused. "Gavin?" He looked. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me about her." He didn't answer because there wasn't an answer that would have been adequate. She seemed to understand that because she went without waiting for one. He stood at the window a while longer. The fire was still there, he thought. It wasn't what it was, but it was there. By the third morning, the snow had stopped, and the sky had cracked open into the violent, clear blue that only came after a storm had emptied itself completely. The men dug. It was the only thing to do, and they did it with the grim efficiency of people who had been inside long enough and were not interested in conversation, just progress. Gavin worked alongside Roy Phipps and Tom Reardon, and even Silas Crow, who showed up with decent gloves and did his share without complaining, which Gavin credited him for, even though he didn't especially want to. It took most of the morning to clear the road enough for wagons. People left in stages. The families with small children first, then the elderly, then the rest. There were handshakes and backslaps, and one moment where Ruth Aldis hugged Martha Hollis for a long time, and nobody said anything because the 3 days had been something, even if it was hard to name exactly what. Gavin was loading his wagon when he heard Silas Crow's voice carrying across the churchyard. That practiced, resonant voice that always seemed to be performing for a room, even when it was outdoors. "Miss Ashcroft, I insist on seeing you safely home. The road's still rough, and your horse—" "My horse is fine, Mr. Crow. She's done this road in worse. Still, I'd feel better if— I appreciate the thought. Polite, firm. I'll manage." Gavin kept loading his wagon. He was not watching. He happened to have a clear line of sight to where they were standing, which was a geographical coincidence. He watched Silas take Evelyn's elbow again. Same gesture as before, proprietary and smooth, and say something lower that Gavin couldn't hear. He watched Evelyn listen and nod, and respond with the careful politeness of a woman who had been managing men who didn't quite hear no for her entire adult life. He watched Silas escort her to her horse, hold the reins while she mounted, which she didn't need. Gavin could see she was comfortable on horseback, and then stand watching her go with the expression of a man making calculations. Gavin tied off his wagon and went to see the Reverend about the door hinge he'd fixed, which needed one more nail, and he kept his hands busy and his expression neutral, and he didn't let himself think too hard about the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the second morning in the church, the thing he didn't have a name for and wasn't sure he was allowed to have. He drove home through snow that sparkled in the hard winter sunlight. The road was rough. His horses knew it and picked their way carefully, and he let them set the pace. He was halfway home when he thought about her hands around the coffee cup, the warmth she was finding in the bottom of it, the worn cuffs of her coat. He thought about her saying, "Don't apologize for it. She sounds like she was worth talking about." He thought about the particular kind of person who asked what someone was like, rather than how they were doing. He pulled the wagon up short on the empty road, in the middle of all that white silence, and sat there for a moment with his hands on the reins and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. The horses waited. "I know," he said. To them, or to himself, or to nobody. He clicked his tongue, and they moved on. Gut. The Sunday after the storm, Pine Hollow was a different place. Not transformed. It was still 43 families and one narrow street and a church with a stovepipe that rattled, but something had shifted in the way people moved through it. 3 days confined together had a way of rearranging who knew what about whom. Alliances had formed over shared meals. Conversations had happened in the middle of the night that wouldn't have happened any other way. People had seen each other in their worst and most tired and most honest, and that changed things. Gavin came in through the side door. He took his usual pew, old habit, but when the service ended and people began filling the center aisle with handshakes and the usual slow migration toward the door, he didn't put his hat on immediately. He sat. He waited. He told himself he was just not rushing. Animals don't know it's Sunday. He didn't have to race back. He watched Silas Crow cross the room to Evelyn's side before the organ bench was even fully vacated, and he watched Silas say something that made the people nearby nod and smile, something that read as charming, appropriate, publicly courteous. Silas was good at this. There was no denying it. Gavin watched Evelyn smile. The polite one, the careful one, the one that was not the same as when she'd bent her head toward the child in the corner and her face had opened up and been real. He put his hat on. He stood. He was at the door when he made the decision he hadn't realized he'd been approaching, the way you didn't always see the edge of a ridge until you were standing at it. He turned around. He walked back through the dispersing crowd, past Roy Phipps, who gave him a curious look, past Martha Hollis, who gave him a sharper one, and he came to where Evelyn was gathering her sheet music with Silas Crow standing just close enough to be a statement. Silas looked at him with the measured politeness of a man assessing something he wasn't sure about. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "Crow." Gavin looked at Evelyn. "I wanted to ask if you'd mind walking out to the step for a minute." Evelyn blinked, a small, surprised blink. She looked at Silas briefly, then back at Gavin, and then something in her settled, that calm, clear quality she had that took things at face value rather than making them complicated. "Of course," she said. Silas stayed where he was. His expression didn't change, but Gavin felt his eyes on their backs as they moved toward the door. On the church steps, the winter air was brutal and clean. The sky was low and white, threatening another round of snow. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter, and he saw again the worn cuffs, thin and inadequate. "You didn't have to rescue me," she said, but she said it like she didn't entirely mind. "I wasn't—" He stopped. "I wasn't sure if that was what I was doing." She looked at him, waiting, the way she was good at waiting. He had not planned this part. He hadn't planned any of it. He just turned around in a doorway and walked back, and now he was standing on cold church steps with wind cutting down from the ridge. And he didn't have a speech or a strategy or anything except the plain truth, which was going to have to be enough. "I have something for you," he said. Not now. I'm not ready yet." He stopped because that sounded like something you said when you were about to do something, and he was not ready to be doing anything yet. He looked out at the white road. "I wanted to say that I don't think Crow deserves the look you give him." She was very still. "What look is that?" "The one that's keeping something back." He said it quietly, and he was looking at the road, not at her. "You're polite to him, which is the right thing, but you're not easy with him. You're careful." A pause. "Some people require more care than others," she said. "Yeah." He finally looked at her. "I just wanted you to know that I see the difference between the careful and the not careful." He stopped. "That's all." She looked at him for what felt like a long time. Her breath made clouds in the cold air. "I see you too," she said finally, in case that needed saying. He didn't answer. He wasn't sure he had an answer. She went back inside. He stood on the cold steps and let the wind come down off the ridge and hit him, and he did not feel less cold, but he felt something that was not peace exactly, but was in the same neighborhood. And he stood there and breathed it in like a man coming up from deep water who'd almost forgotten what air tasted like. The sky pressed down, white and heavy, already getting ready to snow again. He'd known Pine Hollow winters his whole life. They were long and hard, and they did not apologize for themselves. He stood there anyway. The snow came back as promised. It came back the following Tuesday in a quieter way than the blizzard. No wall of white, no sudden burial. Just a steady, patient accumulation that added 2 inches by morning and 2 more by afternoon and showed no particular interest in stopping. The kind of snow that didn't announce itself. It just kept arriving until everything was different. Gavin spent Tuesday morning in the barn with the sheep he'd brought inside, and he spent it thinking about what he'd said on the church steps, which was not something he'd intended to spend time thinking about, but which had apparently made other plans. He replayed it the way you replayed a thing you couldn't change. Not obsessively, just repeatedly, the way a tongue found a sore tooth without permission. "I just wanted you to know that I see the difference." He had said that. Out loud. On church steps. To a woman he'd spoken to maybe a combined total of 20 minutes prior to the blizzard and perhaps an hour during it. One of the older ewes, the one he privately called Agnes, though he'd never told anyone he named them, pressed her head against his knee the way she did when she sensed he was distracted. "Don't," he said. Agnes pressed harder. "I know," he said. "I know." He didn't know what he was going to do about it. He had some awareness of the general shape of what doing something might look like, but the shape was rough and uncertain, like a hill seen in bad weather. You knew there was something there. You just weren't sure of the edges. What he knew for certain was this. Silas Crow had been in Pine Hollow for 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks had made himself indispensable in the visible, social way that money made easy. He'd donated wood to 3 families after the blizzard. He'd offered the use of his horses for road clearing without being asked. He'd sat in the front pew last Sunday. The front pew, where the Reverend could see your face and everyone else could see your back. And he'd sung with the full confidence of a man who knew he was being watched and was comfortable with it. These were not bad things, Gavin told himself carefully. A man who helped clear roads and donated firewood was not a villain. He was just a man who operated in the light, deliberately and well, and who had fixed his attention on Evelyn Ashcroft in a way that was becoming clear to everyone in Pine Hollow who had eyes, including, probably, Evelyn. What Gavin didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was whether the polite, careful smile was all she felt, or whether there was something warmer underneath it that she wasn't showing in public. He wasn't entitled to that information. He had no standing to ask for it. He knew what he'd seen on the church steps when she'd said, "I see you too." He knew what her face had done. But he also knew he was a man who'd spent 2 years misreading the size and shape of his own interior life. He wasn't sure he trusted his own reading anymore. Agnes pressed her head against his knee a third time. "All right," he said. He put his hand on her wool and let the warmth of her come through his palm. "All right." He sat in the barn while the snow fell on the roof above him, and he thought about the worn cuffs of her coat, and the ink stain on her second finger, and the way she played the organ like nobody was watching, and the one thing she'd asked of him that nobody else had in 2 years. What was she like? He'd answered that question. He'd given her Margaret, not all of Margaret, nobody had all of Margaret except him, and whatever came after, but a real piece. The laugh, the opinions, the way she took up space. He'd given that away in a cold church during a snowstorm, and he hadn't regretted it for a second. That told him something. He wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but it told him something. Oh, he thought about it for 3 days before he went to see Clara Webb. Clara Webb ran the dry goods side of the general store and was, more relevantly, the finest hand knitter in Pine Hollow and possibly the territory. She was 61, had fingers like old oak roots, and made things with wool that other people made with prayers. Functional, beautiful, built to last. She'd made the mittens that kept the Phipps children alive through the winter of '84, and the shawl that Ruth Aldous still wore to everything, and a pair of socks that old Ward Jennings claimed were the only reason his feet still worked. Gavin came into the store on a Thursday afternoon when it was mostly empty, stomped the snow off his boots, and waited until Clara finished with her current customer before he approached the counter. She looked up at him with the directness of a woman who had dealt with every kind of man who walked into a store and had long ago stopped performing patience. "Gavin Mercer," she said. "What do you need?" It wasn't a question. Clara didn't do questions when statements would do. "I have wool," he said, "from my own flock. I sheared it off the best 3, the ones with the longest, cleanest fleece, and I cleaned and carded it myself." He set a cloth bundle on the counter. "I need someone to spin it, and then I need someone to knit it into something specific." Clara looked at the bundle. She picked it up, felt the weight, opened one corner, and rubbed the wool between her fingers. Her face didn't give anything away, but she took her time, which with Clara was itself a kind of response. "That's good wool," she said. "I know." "What's the something specific?" He described it. Cuffs. Not mittens, not gloves. Cuffs, long ones, designed to pull over the wrist and forearm, to sit below a coat sleeve and cover what the coat didn't. Warm. Simple. Not decorative. He described the size as best he could. He had looked, carefully and without making it obvious, at the circumference of Evelyn's wrists during the storm, had noted the length of her forearm relative to the length of her coat sleeve. He was precise. He had a good eye for measurement. Horses required it. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him for a moment. "For who?" she said. "That's not part of the commission." Clara's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's a woman's size." "Clara." All right." She set the wool bundle down and smoothed the cloth with one palm. "You want them done when?" "Before Christmas, if you can manage it." She squinted at him. "That's 2.5 weeks." "I know. I'll pay accordingly. You'll pay what I ask regardless because you want them done by Christmas." She wasn't wrong. "I'll need 2 days to spin. 4, maybe 5 to knit if I set aside the Aldi's commission temporarily, which Ruth will forgive me for if I explain." She looked at him steadily. "You'll do the explaining." "Fair." She picked up the wool bundle and turned toward the back room. "Whoever she is," she said without turning around, "she'd better deserve it." Gavin put his hat back on. "She does," he said quietly. It was the most honest thing he'd said out loud in months. He walked back to his wagon in the cold and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before he picked up the reins. The commission was placed. There was no taking it back now, even if he wanted to. And he found, sitting in the thin winter sunlight outside the general store, that he didn't particularly want to. That feeling was unfamiliar. He sat with it carefully, the way you sat with something fragile, checking for the crack you expected to find. It held. The following Sunday, Silas Crow sat beside Evelyn during the meal after service. There was always a meal now, since the blizzard, as if the community had discovered it liked eating together and seen no reason to stop. And he did it with the ease of a man who had decided something without announcing it. He passed her the bread before she asked. He refilled her cup. He angled his body toward her in a way that was, to anyone watching, clear as weather. Several people were watching. Pine Hollow was good at watching without appearing to. Gavin sat across the room and ate his food and watched the wall. Roy Phipps sat down next to him, which Roy did now with the comfortable familiarity of a man who'd decided they were friends, whether Gavin had agreed to it or not. "Crow's moving fast," Roy said, not quietly enough. "Roy, I'm just observing." "Observe something else." Roy ate his food. "You know," he said after a minute, "some men, what they do is they sit and watch and don't do anything, and then the thing they were watching gets taken by somebody who is actually willing to move." He said it in the tone of a man sharing a general observation about no one in particular. "Roy, just philosophically speaking, I'm aware of that general dynamic," Gavin said. "Good." Roy ate more food. "Glad we talked." Gavin did not respond to this. He looked at his beans. He thought about the wool he'd given to Clara Webb, which was currently being spun into something on a wheel in the back of the general store, and the careful measurement he'd made of a woman's wrist and forearm without her knowledge, and the particular combination of audacity and terror that had been living in his chest for the past week. He looked up across the room. Evelyn was listening to something Silas was saying. Her face was pleasant and attentive. Then her eyes moved, just briefly, just passing, and landed on Gavin, and held there for 1 second that was longer than a second before moving on. He looked back at his beans. "All right," he thought, "all right." He went to the schoolhouse on a Wednesday. He hadn't planned it with that much intention. He'd been in town for supplies, and he was on the way back, and he walked past the schoolhouse and heard, through the closed door, the particular sound of children reciting something together, the flat unison of 30 voices saying the same words at the same time. He stopped on the porch step without knowing he was going to. Through the window, he could see the top half of the room. Children at desks in rows. Evelyn at the front, writing something on the slate board that he couldn't quite make out. She was tall at the board, taller than she seemed when she was sitting, and she wrote quickly, with the second finger that had the ink stain, and then turned and said something that made 3 of the children in the front row laugh. He stood on the porch step feeling like a fool. He knocked anyway. She came to the door herself, which surprised him. He'd expected a student. And when she opened it and found him there, her face did the small, rapid recalibration of someone who was genuinely surprised. Gavin. Not Mr. Mercer. That had been settled during the blizzard. "Is something wrong?" "No." He held up the sack he was carrying. "I had extra oats from a surplus order. Dry goods stores said you mentioned the school stove goes through them faster than expected." He stopped. It was true. Martha Hollis had said exactly that in the general store while he happened to be standing nearby. He had been in the general store for nails and had walked out with nails and 50 pounds of oats. "I thought you could use them." She looked at him, then at the sack, then back at him. "You bought oats for the school stove." "They were surplus," he said, which was not true. She was quiet for a moment. Then she held the door open wider. "Come in out of the cold." He came in. 30 children stared at him with the uncomplicated directness that children had before they learned not to. He stood inside the door holding 50 pounds of oats and feeling approximately 7 feet too large for the space. "This is Mr. Mercer," Evelyn said to the room. "He runs the stable south of town. Some of your family's horses board with him." She looked at him. "The oats go in the back room. I'll show you." He followed her through the room, past 30 pairs of eyes, and into the small back room that smelled of chalk dust and wood smoke and something sweet he couldn't identify. He set the oats down next to the stove. "You didn't have to do that," she said, quietly enough that the children wouldn't hear. "I know. I could have put in a supply order." "I know." He straightened. "I had them." She looked at him the way she looked at things, directly, unhurried. The light in the back room was low, coming from a single lamp, and it caught the particular gray-green of her eyes and the ink on her finger. "Is that what this is?" she asked, and she said it without coyness, without performing the question, just asking it plainly in the way she asked everything plainly. "Oats for the school stove?" He looked at her. He looked at the wall. He looked back at her. "No," he said. "It's not just that." She waited. He had not prepared anything to say. He had the oats. He had the wool at Clara Webb's. He had the precise measurement of a wrist and the memory of thin coat cuffs in cold air. He did not have words that were shaped correctly for what was actually happening inside him, and he suspected there were no such words, and he was going to have to use the inadequate ones and hope she could read the shape underneath them. "I'm not good at this," he said, "at whatever this is." He gestured vaguely, which was not helpful. Before, I used to be better at being with people, talking, not moving through a room like I'm trying not to touch the walls." She didn't say anything. "I'm working on it," he said. I don't have anything to offer that looks like what Crow's offering. I don't have a big property or," he stopped. "I have 64 sheep and a barn that needs one more round of weatherproofing and 3 horses that legally may not be mine." He heard how that sounded. "That's not a sales pitch." She almost smiled. Almost. "What is it then?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. I know that I can hear the difference in your playing between when you're doing it because you have to and when you're doing it because you can't not. And I know what your face looks like when you're actually there versus when you're being careful." He stopped. "And I know you asked me about Margaret, and I know I answered." The room was very quiet. "You did," she said. "I hadn't answered that before. Anybody." He said it plain. 2 years, nobody asked it right. You asked it right." She was still looking at him, and he was aware that this conversation had moved somewhere that he hadn't entirely charted, and he wasn't sure he had the navigation for it. But he was also aware that the particular ache in his chest, the one that had been there since the morning in the church when she'd handed him a cup of thin coffee and stood by the stove in the gray light, was more bearable when he was talking than when he wasn't. "I'm not asking for anything right now," he said, "because that was true too. I just wanted you to know that I'm aware of you, in a way I haven't been aware of anything in a long time." He picked up his empty hands and looked at them. "I thought you deserved to know that." Evelyn looked at him for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable and then just barely past uncomfortable, and then she said, "Is that so?" It wasn't exactly a question. "Yeah," he said. She breathed in and out once, slowly. Her expression was not the careful, polite one, and it was not the bright one from the child in the corner, and it was not the one from the organ bench. It was something else, something that she was not performing because there was nobody to perform for in a back room with a stove and 50 pounds of oats. "I'm aware of you too," she said. In case that remained unclear, he looked at her. "It was somewhat clear," he said. "Somewhat." She picked up a piece of chalk from the shelf beside the stove, turned it in her fingers. The ink stain moved. "Gavin." "Yeah." "I'm going to go back to my students," she said, "because I have a classroom full of children who are right now almost certainly doing something they shouldn't." She paused. "But I think we should talk, properly, when there's time." "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." She nodded once, the inventory nod, the everything accounted for nod, and went back through the door to the classroom. He stood in the back room for a moment with the cold stove and the oats. He could hear her voice through the door, clear and calm, redirecting whatever chaos had developed in her absence. He heard a child laugh. He heard her laugh too, the real one, the unperformed one. He put on his coat and went out the back door and stood in the cold alley behind the schoolhouse and breathed. The thing in his chest was not less there, but it had changed quality. It was less like something pressing inward and more like something pressing outward, which was different in a way he couldn't quite articulate but could absolutely feel. He walked back to his wagon. He'd left it tied at the post on the main street, and when he got there, the horse was looking at him with the mild, patient expression of an animal who had been waiting in the cold and was ready to go home. "Me too," Gavin said. He climbed up, settled in, picked up the reins. The drive home was the same drive it always was. The same road, the same ridgeline, the same turn where you lost sight of the town, and the valley opened up into just snow and sky and the black lines of fence posts. But he made it the same way he'd made the last stretch of every morning since the blizzard, which was without counting reasons. He just went home. And for a mile or two, he almost didn't mind it. Clara Webb finished the cuffs on a Thursday, 12 days after he'd placed the commission. He came in to pick them up, and she set them on the counter without ceremony, and he picked them up and turned them in his hands and felt the weight of them, the dense warmth that good wool held even before a body was inside it. They were charcoal gray, which was what he'd asked for, with a simple pattern at the edge that he hadn't asked for but that Clara had apparently decided the piece required, small and precise and not showy. "Those are good," he said. "I know they are." Clara folded her hands on the counter. "You want a box for them?" "If you have one." She produced a small wooden box lined with paper, the kind she used for things that were gifts even when nobody was using that word out loud. She set the cuffs inside. She closed the lid. "You going to wait until Christmas?" she asked. He looked at the box. He thought about the Sunday meals. He thought about Silas Crow refilling a cup. He thought about "I'm aware of you too," said quietly in a room with no audience. "No," he said. "I don't think so." Clara nodded like she'd expected this. "Smart," she said. He paid her, more than she asked because it was more than she asked, and he put the box inside his coat where the cold couldn't get to it, and he walked out into the gray December afternoon. He had a plan now, a rough one, the same kind as the hill in bad weather. He could see the general shape, just not all the edges. But it was there, and it was real. And for the first time in 2 years, the future tense felt less like something that was happening to him and more like somewhere he was choosing to go. He pressed his hand against his coat where the box sat, felt the solid corner of it against his palm, and he walked back to his wagon through the snow that had started again, quiet and patient, the way the good ones always were. The Sunday he chose was the last one before Christmas. He knew it the moment he woke up, not because he'd planned it with any precision, but because when he lay in the dark doing his morning count, the reasons to wait had finally run out. He'd been carrying that wooden box inside his coat for 4 days, which was 2 days longer than made any sense, and the box had developed the particular weight of a thing that was waiting to become something else. He got up, fed the animals, put on his good shirt, the stiff-collared one, and stood in front of the small mirror above the washstand for a moment longer than he normally would. He looked like himself. That was the best he could say. A man who worked outside and hadn't slept enough and had a scar across his left jaw from a fence incident in '83. Not a man who looked like he had anything polished to offer. He drove to church with the box on the seat beside him, which was not practical, but felt right. The service was longer than usual. Christmas hymns took time, and Reverend Hollis had prepared remarks that expanded to fill the available space, as remarks tended to. Gavin sat in his usual pew for the last time, without understanding it was the last time. He held his hat on his knee and watched the back of other people's heads, and listened to the organ, and did not look at the organist because, if he looked, he would lose what little composure he had managed to assemble. The community meal afterward was louder than usual. Someone had brought a dried apple cake. The Wheeler children were chasing each other between the tables. Silas Crow was near the front, talking to the Reverend and 2 other men with the easy authority of someone who had firmly established himself as a person of standing in this community in the span of 2 months. Gavin sat with his food and waited. He had said to Evelyn in the back room of the schoolhouse that he wanted to talk properly when there was time. She had said yes. That conversation had not yet happened, not for lack of either of them wanting it, but because the days between then and now had been full of weather and work and the particular density of a frontier December that left very little room for anything that wasn't survival. They had spoken 3 times since the schoolhouse, twice briefly in the churchyard, once in passing at the general store where they'd stood in the flower aisle for 10 minutes, talking about nothing in particular and everything in general, the way you talked when you were working up to something and hadn't gotten there yet. He was going to get there today. That was the decision. He was done with the other side of it. He ate his food without tasting it, and kept track of where she was in the room the way he kept track of weather. Not anxiously, just as information he needed to have. She was near the south window with Martha Hollis, talking and eating, occasionally glancing toward the group of children who'd gotten loudly out of hand in the corner. The worn cuffs of her coat were on the chair beside her. He looked at those cuffs. He put down his spoon. He stood up, which Roy Phipps noticed immediately from across the table, and Roy's eyes went from Gavin's face to the direction Gavin was looking and back, and Roy had the sense for once to say nothing at all. Gavin walked across the room. He moved around the Wheeler children and past the table where Hector Aldous was asleep upright again. He came to where Evelyn was standing, and Martha Hollis turned to look at him with an expression that contained an entire conversation he was not having with her right now. "Evelyn," he said, "would you step outside with me for a few minutes?" Martha's expression intensified. Evelyn looked at him with that direct, calm gaze, and whatever she read in his face made her set down her cup without hesitation. "Yes," she said simply. She took her coat from the chair. He noticed the cuffs again, couldn't help it. And he held the door and they went out together into the white December afternoon. The oak tree stood 20 feet from the side of the church, an enormous old thing that had been there longer than Pine Hollow itself, older than anyone could say with certainty. In summer, it was the kind of tree that defined the landscape around it. In winter, stripped bare, it was something else. All black branches against white sky, complicated and stark and not hiding anything. They walked to it without discussion, as if they'd agreed on the destination. The cold was immediate and serious. Their breath made clouds. The snow was packed hard underfoot and it compressed and squeaked under their boots with each step. Behind them, through the church walls, they could hear the muffled sound of other people, so children's voices, someone laughing. But out here it was just wind and silence and the creak of the oak's branches. Gavin reached inside his coat and brought out the wooden box. He held it for a moment. Then he held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. She didn't take it yet. "What is this?" "Open it." She took it with both hands and lifted the lid and looked at what was inside. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She looked at the cuffs, the charcoal wool, the small, precise pattern at the edge, and her expression did something that went through several things too quickly for him to name all of them. "I made the wool," he said. I sheared it and cleaned it and carded it. Clara Webb did the spinning and knitting, but it's from my flock." He stopped. "I noticed your sleeves. The cuffs were thin. I noticed that in the storm." She was still looking at the box. "That was weeks ago," she said. "I know." "You noticed weeks ago, and you—" She looked up. Her eyes were very bright. Not crying, just very present, like something in her was paying sharp attention. "Gavin, I know it's not—" He stopped again. He had done this before, started sentences and stalled in the middle of them, and he decided the only way through was straight. "I know it's not grand. Crow could have someone make you something 10 times more expensive, and he'd do it without thinking twice about it. I know that." He held her gaze. "But I thought about what you'd need, and I used my own materials, and I asked someone who makes good things to make it with care. That's what I had to give." She closed the lid of the box. She pressed both palms flat against it, and he watched her breathe. One careful breath, in and out. "It's not about Silas Crow," she said. "I know. I need you to actually know that, not just say it." "I know," he said again, and this time he meant it the way she was asking him to mean it. "I said it because I wanted you to understand that I understand what I'm not. I'm not going to try to be something I'm not. I'm asking you to see what I am." She looked at him then in the way she had of looking at things, all the way at them, without blinking, without making it soft. The wind moved her hair and she didn't fix it. The cold made her cheeks red in the particular uneven way cold did, one side more than the other, and there was nothing polished about any of it, and he was aware of loving all of it in a way that hit him sideways, a way he hadn't expected and hadn't braced for. He reached inside his coat again. Not the box this time. The box was in her hands. This was something smaller, a piece of paper he'd folded and refolded until the creases were soft. He held it, but didn't give it to her yet. "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you for 3 weeks," he said. "I had better versions of it in my head, longer ones, things that made more sense. He looked at the paper in his hand and then put it back in his pocket because that was not how he wanted to do this. I'm going to say the plain version instead. She waited. She was so good at waiting. I spent 2 years not wanting anything, he said. Not on purpose. I didn't decide to. It just happened. The future stopped feeling like something I was part of. He looked at the oak tree, at the bare black branches against the white sky. I came to church every week because it was the one fixed thing. I sat in the back so I could leave. I had my system and my reasons, and I was managing. That's all I was doing, managing. He paused. Then you handed me a cup of terrible coffee in a snowstorm and sat across from me and asked what Margaret was like. Evelyn was very still. And I answered, he said. First time in 2 years I answered that question. First time anyone asked it right. He turned back to look at her. I don't think that's small. I think that's the thing that started something back up, something I thought was done. He swallowed. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I've got everything figured out. I don't. I'm still a man with 64 sheep and a barn and 3 legally ambiguous horses and a bad habit of talking to animals more than people. He watched her face. But I'm standing here instead of sitting in the back pew, which is new. And I want to be honest with you more than I've wanted anything in a long time, which is also new. The wind came down off the ridge in a long, slow gust that moved through the oak's branches above them with a sound like breathing. I'm asking you to let me court you properly, he said. I'm asking if you'd allow me that. He paused, because the rest of it was there, and it was going to come out whether he was ready or not. And I want you to know that when I say properly, I mean with intention. I'm not asking to walk beside you for a season and see what happens. I'm asking because I think you're the kind of person a man builds toward. And I think I want to build again. He stopped. His voice had done something at the end of that, and he didn't try to correct it. I haven't wanted to build in 2 years. That's not nothing. He stopped talking. The silence that followed was not comfortable or uncomfortable. It was just full. The way silences were when the thing that needed saying had finally been said and everything was waiting to settle. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Her hands were still pressed flat on the wooden box. The cold had made her eyes water slightly, or something else had. He couldn't tell and didn't presume. I moved to Pine Hollow, she said slowly, because I needed somewhere that required me to be necessary. She seemed to be finding the words while she said them, the way she did sometimes, honest rather than prepared. Cheyenne was fine. The work was fine, but I was dispensable there. Here, if I don't show up, the children don't learn, the organ doesn't play. She looked down at the box. That sounds like a small thing. It's not small, he said. No. She looked back up at him. And then I got here and there was this man in the back pew who left every Sunday before anyone could speak to him. And I thought, I know that feeling. Not the same reason, but the motion of it. The moving before anyone can get close. She paused. I watched you for months, Gavin. Not because I was waiting for something, just because you were the most honest person in that room without saying a single word. Everything about the way you moved told the truth. He looked at her. He did not have words for what that did to him. He didn't try to find them. I'm not looking for someone to make my life easier, she said. I've been managing on my own for 4 years, and I know how to do that. I'm looking for... She stopped, started again. I'm looking for someone who sees me without deciding first what I ought to be. I see you, he said. It came out quiet, but direct. I have been seeing you for months. Probably longer than was wise before I understood what I was looking at. She breathed. The box was between her hands, warm now from her palms. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, a little steadier. You can court me. Properly and with intention, like you said. Something moved across her face. Not the polite smile and not the bright child in the corner smile, but something he hadn't seen before. Something that was entirely for this moment. Although I want to say for the record that you've been doing a fairly thorough job of it already, with the terrible coffee and the 50 pounds of oats. Something broke open in his chest, warm and sudden, like a stove damper finally opened all the way. He almost smiled. It was close enough to a real one that she saw it, and her own face answered it. The oats were surplus, he said. They absolutely were not. Clara Webb, he said. She told Martha Hollis you looked like a man who'd made up his mind. Clara Webb talks too much. Clara Webb is never wrong. She held the box against her chest. Help me put these on. He took the box back from her, lifted out the left cuff, and she extended her arm, and he pulled the wool over her wrist and forearm, settling it carefully at the edge of her coat sleeve. Then the right. He did it with the same attention he gave to things that mattered. No rush, no performance. Just the task, done right. She flexed her fingers when he was done. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. They're warm, she said. Good wool, he said. Best 3 animals I have, which is saying something. High praise, she said. From a man who talks to his sheep. I never said... He stopped. Roy Phipps. Roy Phipps, she confirmed. He shook his head, and this time it was actually a smile, the kind that moved his whole face in a way he hadn't let happen in a long time, and that felt frankly strange and good in equal measure. They stood beneath the oak for another minute, not saying anything, which did not feel like a failure. The branches moved in the wind above them. Behind the church walls, the town went on with its noise and its business and its careful watching, but out here there was just the cold and the white ground and the 2 of them standing in it, neither one moving to go back inside yet. You should know, she said finally, that this is going to be the talk of Pine Hollow by morning. Was already the talk of Pine Hollow, he said. Fair point. She looked at the church, then back at him. Martha Hollis is probably watching through the window right now. Almost certainly. And Roy Phipps. Without question. She considered this. Well, she said, let them watch. She said it with the simplicity of a woman who had decided something and was not in the habit of undeciding it. He held out his arm. She took it, not the proprietary elbow hold, not a performance, just her hand through the crook of his arm, warm in the new wool cuffs, and they walked back across the snow toward the church door together. He felt the watching from the windows as they came up the steps. He felt the sudden drop in conversation level that was people trying to look like they hadn't been looking. He held the door for her. She went in ahead of him. He followed. He did not go to the back pew. He stood just inside the door for a moment, hat in hand, and he looked at the room, at the familiar faces, at Roy Phipps, whose expression was the most purely delighted thing Gavin had ever seen on a human face, at Martha Hollis, who nodded at him once with the satisfaction of a woman whose private predictions had proven correct, at Silas Crow, who stood near the far window and met his gaze directly, and after a moment gave a small single nod that was more gracious than Gavin expected, and more honest than anything else Silas had done in Pine Hollow. He nodded back. Evelyn had gone to sit with Martha, and she was already unwrapping the cuffs to show them off, and Martha's hands were on them immediately, examining the wool, examining the pattern at the edge, looking at Gavin across the room with an expression that meant Clara Webb does good work, and you did a good thing, and I'm not going to say so directly. He found a spot along the wall, not the back, not the front, somewhere in the middle, and he leaned against it with his arms folded, and he looked at the room around him, and he breathed. The warmth of the church came through his coat slowly. Outside, the sky had gone white again, the particular white that meant more snow before nightfall. The Wheeler children resumed their chase. Hector Aldous woke up and immediately began a sentence that was clearly the continuation of a story he'd been telling in his sleep. Ruth Aldous opened the door to let a gust of cold in, made a noise about it, and closed it again. Gavin stood in the middle of all of it. He did not count his reasons. He did not calculate his exit. He just stood there, in the middle of a room full of people who knew his name and his losses and his bad habits, and he let himself be there. It was not comfortable exactly. It was not perfect. It was 43 families and too many opinions and a church that needed work on its east wall before spring. But it was his. It had always been his. He'd just been standing in the wrong part of it. The courtship of Gavin Mercer and Evelyn Ashcroft was not, by any measure, a graceful thing. It was 2 people who had both spent significant time alone trying to remember how to be known by someone else, which turned out to be harder than either of them expected. There were evenings where conversation stalled and they sat in uncomfortable silence on the porch of the schoolhouse, and neither one knew how to move through it. There were moments where Gavin's old habits surfaced without warning. The retreating, the going quiet, the way his face shut down when something got too close to the center of him. There were moments where Evelyn was too patient in a way that was its own kind of wall, where she absorbed everything and gave back nothing, and he couldn't tell what she actually felt about any of it. They were, in other words, two real people attempting a real thing, and it was not always easy. January was the hardest month. The cold was absolute and unrelenting, and the days were short and dark in a way that pressed on a person's interior life, whether they wanted it to or not. Gavin came to town twice a week, Wednesdays and Sundays, and each time he came, he stayed longer than the time before. They walked when the weather allowed it. They ate together at the community meals that had become a permanent fixture since the blizzard. They talked, awkwardly at first, then better, then occasionally with a fluency that surprised him, like a language coming back that he'd thought he'd lost. He told her things he hadn't told anyone. Not everything. Some of it was still not ready for air, but more than he'd expected. He told her about the first winter after Margaret, which had been the worst, where he'd gone 2 weeks without speaking to a living soul, and had found at the end of it that he wasn't sure he wanted to start again. He told her he still had nights where he woke up reaching across the bed and the emptiness hit him like a physical thing. He told her he didn't know if that would ever stop completely, and he thought she deserved to know that. She listened the way she always listened, all the way, without filling it with herself. And then she told him things in return. That she'd left Cheyenne because of a man who had not hurt her in any dramatic way but had slowly, over 2 years, made her feel smaller than she was. That she'd come to Pine Hollow because small towns required all of you, and she wanted to be required. That she was not, as her mother had been trying to tell her since she was 22, afraid of a quiet life. She was afraid of a life that was quiet in the wrong way. Quiet because nothing was happening, rather than quiet because everything important was already there. "Is that what this is?" he asked. They were walking the road south of town, frozen hard under a January sky that had gone that deep winter blue right before dark. "The second kind?" She thought about it. She didn't give him the easy answer. "Getting there," she said. He nodded. That was honest. He could work with honest. Then February brought a thaw that lasted 4 days, and then a hard freeze that was worse than anything before it, which was the mountain's way of reminding everyone that hope was provisional. 2 of Gavin's ewes delivered early lambs that had no business surviving the temperature, and he spent 3 nights in the barn with them, sleeping on hay with his coat over his knees, feeding them from a bottle every 2 hours through the dark. Evelyn came out on the second night. She just appeared in the barn doorway at 9:30 with a lamp and a jar of something hot, and a look on her face that said she was not here to be told to go home. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know." She came inside and closed the door behind her against the cold. She looked at the lambs, who were in a box of hay near the warmest wall, and her face did the thing it did with the children in her classroom, that complete, unhurried attention. "They're smaller than I expected. They had no business coming this early. Are they going to make it?" He looked at them honestly. "Maybe. If they get through tonight." She sat down on the hay across from the box and set the lamp between them and opened the jar, which turned out to be broth, still hot from the stove. She handed it to him. "Drink." He drank. It was better than he deserved at 9:30 in a cold barn. She stayed until 2 in the morning. She didn't sleep. She sat and watched the lambs, and they talked in the low, unhurried way you talked in the middle of the night, when the rest of the world was elsewhere, and the conversation went places that daytime conversation didn't go. She asked him what he'd wanted to be as a boy. He told her, a horse trader specifically, because he'd been 8 years old and had seen a man come through their county with 17 horses and had thought that was the finest life he could imagine. She told him she'd wanted to be a botanist, which he hadn't expected. And then she told him about the teacher who'd explained when she was 12 that botany was a university subject and the university was not a place for girls, and the particular quality of rage she'd felt at that sentence, which had apparently never entirely left. "Is that why you teach?" he asked. She thought about it. "Partly, I think." She watched one of the lambs shift in the hay box. "I think I teach because every child in that room is standing at the beginning of something, and somebody has to tell them the beginning matters, that what they learn now is going to be in them the rest of their lives." She paused. "My botany teacher was wrong about the university. She was right about everything else she ever taught me. I've thought about that a lot." He nodded slowly. "What was her name?" "Mrs. Garrity." She said it with the particular softness of someone handling a memory they'd carried a long time. She died the year I came here. I didn't find out until 3 months after. I'm sorry, he said. Thank you, she said. And she meant it. He could tell it wasn't just politeness. She actually received it. They sat with that for a while. The barn was cold around them and warm in the small sphere of the lamp. One of the lambs made a sound, and Gavin checked it, and it was all right. He sat back down. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to tell me the honest answer, not the careful one. She looked at him. Silas Crow, he said. Before the oak tree, was there ever anything there that you actually felt? She was quiet for a moment. He waited, because this was what he'd asked for. He was interesting, she said finally. He was smart and he knew things, and he was confident in a way that it wasn't unattractive. She said it plainly, not to wound, just because he'd asked for honest. But interesting isn't the same as I never felt seen by him. I felt appraised. She met his eyes. There's a difference. Yeah, he said. There is. She leaned back against the barn wall. Why are you asking now? Because I needed to know the thing I was afraid to know, he said, and I decided I'd rather know it than not. She looked at him for a long moment. That's new, she said. For you. He considered this. Yeah, he said. It is. Both lambs made it through the night. By morning they were standing on uncertain legs and making the small, indignant sounds of animals who had decided to be alive after all. Gavin stood in the barn doorway in the gray, early light and watched them and felt something that was close to gratitude, though he would not have called it that out loud. Evelyn had fallen asleep somewhere around 4, sitting against the wall with her coat around her shoulders, and he'd put more hay behind her back so she wouldn't wake up sore, and she'd slept through until dawn. And when she woke up and looked at the lambs standing on their own, she made a sound that was not quite a word, and that he would remember specifically for years. He asked her to marry him on the 15th of March, which was not a significant date by any external measure. It was a Tuesday. The weather had turned tentatively warmer, the kind of warmth that still might go back on itself but smelled like it meant it this time. Wet earth, pine sap, the first thin suggestion of green along the south-facing slopes. He had not planned a significant date. He had not planned a significant anything. He had simply reached a point where carrying the question was more weight than he wanted to carry, and the answer seemed like something he already knew, and the gap between what he knew and what he'd actually said out loud was beginning to feel ridiculous. He came to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon when the children had gone home, same as he'd done with the oats in December, except this time he didn't bring anything. He knocked on the door and she opened it and looked at him with the curious calm she always had, reading his face. Come in, she said. I'll only be a minute, he said, which was not quite accurate. He stood inside the door. She stood a few feet away with her arms folded and her chalk-dusty hands visible and her hair coming loose from where she'd pinned it at the start of the day. She looked tired in the way she looked at the end of every Tuesday, which was the day she taught arithmetic to the older children and apparently found it more draining than she let on. Are you all right? She asked. I'm going to ask you something, he said. And I want you to know that I've thought about it, and I'm not asking because I'm afraid you'll leave, or because Crow is still in the valley, or because of any reason that's about something other than what I actually want. He stopped. I'm asking because I know what I want, which is, he said it plain. It's you, it's this, it's whatever this becomes. She unfolded her arms slowly. I'm not going to be easy to be married to, he said. I know that. I go quiet when I shouldn't. I work too hard and I don't always notice when I've been alone in my own head for too long. I talk to my sheep more than is probably normal. He paused. But I will show up. That I can promise. Whatever needs doing, whatever's hard, I will be there for it. He looked at her directly. Will you marry me, Evelyn? The classroom was very quiet. She looked at him for a moment. The full look. The all-the-way look. And her expression was not the surprised one, and not the polite one, and not the careful one. It was the one he'd seen in the barn at 2 a.m. with the lamp between them. It was the one that was entirely real. Yes, she said. Just that. Not immediately, and not after a long dramatic pause. Just at the right moment, the natural moment, the way she answered everything. He breathed. I'm not easy either, she said. I need to say that. I'm too patient in ways that become walls. I expect people to notice things I haven't said. I work. She stopped. I work until I stop working, which means I don't know how to rest until I collapse. Clara Webb has pointed this out to me multiple times. Clara Webb points things out to everyone, he said. She's not wrong. She's rarely wrong. He moved across the room toward her, and she didn't step back. I've noticed those things, he said. The patience that's a wall. The expecting without saying. He looked at her face. I noticed them. They're not, he searched. They're not things I'm agreeing to overlook. They're part of what's there. I want what's actually there. She put one chalk-dusty hand against his chest, not pushing, just placing it there. He covered it with his. All right then, she said. Yes? We've established yes. He almost laughed. He did, actually. A short, surprised sound that came out before he could manage it. She heard it, and her face went fully open, the way it went with the children, the way it went with the lamb in the barn doorway. It was, he thought, the best he had ever looked to himself, reflected in someone else's face. They married in June, when Pine Hollow had gone green and improbable the way it always did, like the mountains were trying to make up for everything they'd done in winter. The ceremony was in the church, which was obvious, and it was short because both of them had agreed they didn't need a long performance of a thing they'd already decided. What they needed was to stand in front of the people who'd watched them get here and say the words that made it official. Gavin stood at the front of the church. Not the back. The front, where you couldn't hide and everyone could see your face, and there was no path to the door that didn't go through the whole room. He had not stood here before. It felt different than he'd expected. Not frightening exactly. Just exposed. Like standing in open country after a long time in the trees. Roy Phipps was beside him, doing an inadequate job of looking like a man who was not close to crying. Hector Aldis was in the front pew and had already said twice that he'd known this would happen, which was not entirely accurate but was the kind of story that would improve with telling, and Gavin did not correct him. When Evelyn came through the door, not in white because this was Pine Hollow and white was impractical, in blue, the deep blue of a winter sky on a clear day, he looked at her and the thing he felt was not dramatic in the way of songs or speeches. It was quieter than that. It was closer to, of course, than to impossible. The feeling of something arriving that had been on its way for a long time. She wore the charcoal cuffs over her dress sleeves, which nobody had asked her to do, and which she had done anyway. And when he saw that, something shifted behind his sternum that he was not prepared for and did not try to hide. She came and stood beside him. "You're in the front," she said quietly, before things got started. "Yeah," he said. "How is it?" He thought about it. "Different," he said. "Better than I thought." She took his hand. He held it. 5 years on from that December under the oak tree, Gavin Mercer stood on the porch of a house that was larger than the one he'd started with and smaller than it needed to be, because they'd built the addition themselves and run short of timber in October and finished it wrong and then fixed it in spring, and the ceiling in the east room was still 2 inches lower than it should have been. He had stopped noticing the ceiling. The children hadn't. His daughter, Clara, named for reasons that made Clara Webb insufferably pleased with herself, had decided the low ceiling in the east room was a specific feature and had claimed it as her domain accordingly. She was 4 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and was, in Gavin's private and carefully unspoken opinion, the most specific human being he had ever encountered. His son James was 2 and was currently in the yard doing something with a stick that seemed to require great concentration. He had inherited, as Roy Phipps never missed an opportunity to point out, his father's tendency to go very quiet when he was working something out. Evelyn came through the porch door with 2 cups of coffee that were not terrible. She'd never told him how she'd improved it over the years, and he'd never asked, because some things you accepted without needing the explanation. And she handed him one and stood beside him, and they looked out at the yard and at the ridge beyond it, going gold in the late afternoon light. The ranch had expanded, not by design exactly, more by the logic of things working and therefore needing more room to work. He was running 90 sheep now. The horse boarding had grown into a small but reliable business. He'd hired a boy from the Reardon family to help 3 days a week, which he'd resisted for 2 years before the math became impossible to argue with. The legally ambiguous horses had been legally resolved, which still made him smile. "James is going to hit himself with that stick," Evelyn said. "Probably." "Are you going to do anything about it?" "He hasn't yet." She sipped her coffee. "That's your system?" "Works for sheep," he said. She leaned against him, not dramatically, just the comfortable lean of someone who had been standing beside this particular person long enough that it required no thought. He put his arm around her and she fit under it the way she always did, which was not perfectly, because nothing fit perfectly, but in the specific way of two things that had adjusted to each other over time. He thought about the man he'd been 6 years ago, in the back pew, moving through his days like someone trying not to disturb the air. He thought about the counting, the 6 reasons, the daily arithmetic of just enough. He thought about the morning he'd driven into a snowstorm rather than stay home, for reasons he still couldn't fully explain, and how that small, unremarkable decision had been the hinge on which everything else turned. He did not think that the universe had planned it. He did not think there was a story written somewhere in which all of this was inevitable. He thought that he'd been stubborn enough to keep showing up even when he couldn't remember why, and that she had been paying attention when he didn't know anyone was, and that somewhere in the overlap of those 2 small facts, something had started. The rest of it, the lambs in February, the oats and the wool, the oak tree, the front of the church, all of that had been the daily work of 2 people choosing each other not once but repeatedly, in the ordinary moments that didn't look like anything important while they were happening. He had learned that. It had taken him a while, but he'd learned it. The important things almost never looked important while they were happening. They looked like Tuesday afternoons and terrible coffee and 50 pounds of oats and staying too long in a conversation that was going somewhere neither person had planned. They looked like showing up when you didn't have a good reason to, and trusting that the reason would become clear later. James hit himself with a stick. He sat down hard in the snow and stared at the stick with an expression of profound personal betrayal. "There it is," Evelyn said. Gavin set down his cup and went down the porch steps and across the yard and crouched down in front of his son, who was now processing whether to cry about it. He looked at the boy's face, the serious eyes, the working-it-out expression, and he recognized that face, knew it the way he knew his own hands. "You all right?" he asked. James considered this with appropriate gravity. "Stick," he said, which was an explanation. "Yeah," Gavin said. "Stick." He held out his hand and James took it, and Gavin pulled him up, steady, and the boy stood and thought about the stick for another second, and then dropped it, and moved on in the way children moved on from things, completely and without ceremony, into whatever was next. Gavin stood back up. His knees reminded him he was 37 and had spent 20 of those years doing physical work in cold weather. He stood up anyway. He looked at Evelyn on the porch. She was watching him with the cup in her hands and the late light on her face and the expression that was not the careful one and not the polite one and not any version she kept for public use, just the one that was for him, for this, for the ordinary Tuesday of their actual life. He had come a long way from the back pew, not in the sense of miles. Pine Hollow was the same 43 families, the same narrow street, the same church with the same east wall that still needed work. He hadn't gone anywhere. He'd stayed exactly where he was. But he was not the same man who had sat in that back row counting reasons to stay in the world and coming up with 6 if he was lucky. He was a man who had been broken open by loss and had not known how to let anything in afterward until something small and persistent had found the gap. A cup of coffee, a direct question, a pair of cold hands around a warm bowl. And the warmth had come back in the way warmth always did, not dramatically, just gradually, until one day he noticed he wasn't cold anymore. He had not earned Evelyn by becoming someone better than himself. He had earned her by being honest about who he actually was, and by staying in the room instead of leaving, and by making the wool with his own hands when he had nothing more impressive to give. That was all. That was the whole of it. He went back up the porch steps and picked up his coffee and stood beside her again. "Claire's been quiet too long," he said. 40 seconds ago, she was right here. "I know. That's the problem." Evelyn set her cup down. I'll go. They looked at each other. "Together," she said. He held the door. They went in together into the house with the low ceiling in the east room and the coffee that had improved mysteriously over the years, and the two children who between them contained every difficult and wonderful quality that their parents had ever tried to hide about themselves. The light came through the west window in long November bars, and the stove was going, and somewhere in the house a small girl was being very quiet, which never meant anything good. It was not a perfect life. It was an actual one. That was, Gavin Mercer had come to understand, the only kind worth building.